Far More Than We Think, Making Sense of Spirituality by Angelo. Chapter 28. The Genie. The Human Genome Project is an international scientific research project with a primary goal of determining the sequence of chemical base pairs that make up human DNA, and of identifying and mapping the total genes of the human body. It is a staggering scientific achievement, and it's amazing to think that there is the equivalent of 3 gigabytes of data stored in every single human cell. It's been estimated that it would take 9.5 years of continual reading to get through the 3 billion data points of a human genome sequence. Yet all of this information exists in each one of the roughly 50 to 75 trillion cells in a human body. We talked in the last chapter about storing infinite amounts of information within ourselves, and these numerical estimates begin to help us see what is happening at just the cellular level. The atomic and subatomic levels are even vaster. There's no end to it. The trouble with focusing on genes and DNA is that we can easily come to believe that everything about ourselves is hard-coded at a cellular level and can't be changed. The age-old debate about nature versus nurture starts to lean heavily in favour of nature, and there is a risk that we simply throw up our hands and conclude that nothing can be done to change. We believe we are the way we are because it's in our genes. The spiritual way is to believe that we can fundamentally change ourselves through adopting spiritual practices. This poses a potential problem because the science is telling us that we are hard-coded to be a certain way by the genes inherited from our parents, whereas spiritual wisdom is telling us that we can choose to be different. This brings us to the next fascinating piece of modern scientific theory, which addresses the link between perception and the biology within our cells. I will attempt to explain it in my own words, but once again, I make no claim that my explanation is error-free or complete. This is simply how I understand it. Our genes, or DNA molecules, are located predominantly in the nucleus of each of our cells. Each cell contains all the functions of an entire human body. When learning this was a surprise to me because I thought we had specific single-purpose cells within us that make up the various body parts and systems. It turns out that each cell contains all the various systems, such as respiration, digestion, reproduction, and so on. The cells are used for different purposes, but they are all mini versions of the systems that make up the human body. One would think that the nucleus containing the genes would be the equivalent of the brain. Experiments have shown, however, that human cells can live for months once the nucleus has been removed. So the nucleus has a function, but it's not essential for life. Something else is controlling the behaviour of the cell. Human cells are like mini machines, with the various machine parts being made out of proteins. Astonishingly, there are approximately 70,000 protein parts in each cell. Each protein is a zigzagged linear string of chemicals, like a string of beads, with each bead being one of the 20 different amino acids. The multitude of different proteins arises due to the different lengths of string and different sequences of amino acids. Each protein forms a shape based on magnetic polarity. In simple terms, a given protein will have either a positive or negative charge at each end of the string and will form a stable shape based on the relative strengths of these polarities. Once an external energy signal or chemical molecule is introduced with an electrical charge of its own, the shape of the protein will change accordingly. This, amazingly, is the basis of all human life. Each of the 70,000 protein parts in every cell is continually changing and moving as a result of interactions with other parts within the cell and responses to external signals. Physical life boils down to mechanical movement of protein parts at the cellular level. The activity of the proteins is controlled by a plethora of external signals and not by the nucleus. The signals that activate the cell are interpreted at the outer membrane layer of the cell and passed inwards. The cell is capable of repairing itself or changing itself by producing new protein parts. The nucleus is the production department for new protein parts and contains the genes, which, if you like, are the blueprints for how to make each part. The protein parts wear out and break down, so need to be replaced after a period of time. This explains why a cell can continue to live for months without the production department in the nucleus, but will eventually die because broken parts are not being replaced. The cell membrane itself contains numerous different protein parts known as receptors and effectors. The receptors are the equivalent of specialist TV aerials, and they sit on the outside layer of the cell and await specific chemical signals. The effector proteins are mechanically linked to the receptors via a processor protein and will execute a particular action when the receptor protein encounters its special signal. The effectors will do things such as open up a gap in the membrane to allow molecules to enter, or initiate secondary signals that produce metabolism, or create a response that changes the shape of the whole cell. So we have a cell with a sensitive membrane that responds in a multitude of complex ways to a range of external signals. The key point here is that the behavior of the cell is controlled by the signals it receives. The signals that it receives are ultimately controlled by the brain's responses to its environment, either consciously or subconsciously, and hence we have the link between environment, thought, and cellular behavior. Without any signals from the brain, the cells will be inactive and life stops. And the brain itself is made of cells, so ultimately all signals arise in the external environment. We know from the cycle of the mind that our thoughts are directly impacted by our perceptions or beliefs. We now see that those perceptions not only drive our thoughts, but control behavior at the cellular level. Our perception, therefore, controls our cellular activity. Meanwhile, back in the nucleus of the cell, we have the 23 pairs of chromosomes that make up our genes, or DNA, with each pair comprising one chromosome from the father and one from the mother. The nucleus is 50% DNA and 50% regulatory protein, which is a protein that effectively provides a sleeve over the DNA so that most of the time the DNA is not active. When the regulatory protein in the nucleus receives the appropriate external signal, it will reveal a portion of the DNA, and then a substance known as messenger RNA makes a copy of the pattern, which is the sequence of amino acids and string lengths required to produce the relevant new protein part. This is how new protein parts are made in the nucleus. The production is triggered by external signals. The genes are not controlling production, but simply churning out new protein parts as and when instructed. Our genes are inherited, but it's the external environment that determines how they operate. Our perception, therefore, not only controls our behavior, but also controls the use of our genes, and hence which new protein parts are produced in the nucleus. The next issue to consider is what happens if our DNA does not contain the required amino acid blueprints to produce the protein parts that are being requested by the external signals. Well, this is the basis of what is known as adaptive mutation, whereby cells will adapt to new environmental conditions by creating new protein parts that were not previously coded into the DNA. The way this works is that the pre-existing DNA contains special genes called genetic engineering genes, and these genes make changes to the existing DNA in response to the environmental signals received. This adaptive mutation is more sophisticated than the idea of random mutation that is the basis of the Darwinian theory of evolution. I will cover updated thinking on evolution in a later chapter, but for now we have the ability of a cell to genetically engineer itself in response to environmental signals. Once again, it's our perception of the environment that drives how our brains react, and hence, amazingly, we now have a link between perception and genetic mutation. We have the science to show that we can change the structure of our genes, and hence our cells, by what we think. We have the ability to turn perception into cellular reality, and it seems that we are busy doing this even if we don't want to. The science is telling us that our bodies will react to what we believe. Well, the placebo effect is an obvious example of how positive beliefs work in our favour, but unfortunately many of us also have many negative beliefs. And this explains, in simple terms, why disease arises from dis-ease. Our conscious and subconscious thoughts produce signals that cause unhealthy genetic mutation. Well, this clearly has huge implications for healthcare, which again I will cover in a later chapter, albeit briefly. Laboratory tests have shown that cells do indeed behave and mutate differently depending on whether the environment is supportive or hostile. Unsurprisingly, the supportive environment produces reproduction and growth, whereas the hostile conditions encourage protection and withdrawal. The opposite ends of the spectrum of potential human brain signals are love and fear. Love encourages a positive reaction and fear produces a negative one. Love promotes growth, whereas fear has a withering effect. And this is what's going on inside of us continually. Love brings us healthy growth right down at the cellular level, whereas fear promotes negative mutation and stagnation or disease. You already know what I'm going to say next. Love comes from spirit, whereas fear derives from ego. If we want to thrive, we're far more likely to achieve this through living as love than residing in fear. This is no longer intangible spiritual theory, but hard scientific fact. Every one of the 50 to 75 trillion cells that comprise our bodies is reacting to how we perceive life. Our perception is our physical reality. And it's also worth noting that the brain itself is comprised of cells, so we must logically have the ability to improve the physicality of our minds through the power of loving thought. A related point here is to look at the impact of stress on our bodily systems. When the brain perceives a threat, it activates the pituitary gland, which then produces hormones that activate our fight or flight modes of behavior. This takes bodily resources away from the growth systems and the immune system. In high levels of stress, the immune system completely shuts down and leaves us open to biological attack and illness. And stressful conditions also tend to call on the subconscious mind for reflex reactions, and our conscious mind will be less effective in these circumstances and will think less clearly. When we perceive the world as a fearful place, our stress levels rise and cause illness and muddled thinking. When we perceive the world with love, we're much more likely to remain healthy and be clear-minded. Our belief systems are like a filter that sits between what's really happening in the world and the signals that our brains transmit into our bodies. This filter is all-powerful because whatever is going on externally will be filtered and distorted by our beliefs. We can turn a beautiful world into a nightmare, and our bodies will react accordingly. Conversely, we can turn challenging circumstances into an opportunity to express love, and the result will be health and happiness. The knowledge contained in this short chapter is potentially life-changing and is widely available for more detailed research. Each of us will draw our own conclusions, but for me, this scientific explanation of the biological power of the mind is totally compelling. We have a genie within us that could be thought of as our individual belief system, and we can always change our beliefs if we choose to. In this respect, the Genie is always available to grant our wishes, and all we have to do is to choose love instead of fear and wait to see what happens. The challenge is to do this on a conscious and subconscious level, because the subconscious mind holds the dominant majority of our beliefs.